What is the Defund the Police movement? In the midst of a long string of murders by police against Black Americans, and the resulting protests, you may have heard calls to defund the police. That might conjure up images in your head of individual cops being harassed, or a crime-ridden post-apocalyptic free-for-all, but these are simply not the outcomes or intentions of this movement. Defund the police is a simple policy demand for governments to spend less and less money on police forces. The rationale behind this movement is built on history, psychology, and financial politics. Together, they explain what's wrong with policing in the first place, the problems with police reform, and how both the status quo and reform are blocking more viable alternatives. First, let's go back in U.S. history to the roots of modern policing. The first U.S. police force was created in Boston, 1838. Boston was a major port city, and shipping businesses hired guards to protect their goods. To save money, these businesses lobbied for tax-funded guards branded as a public safety measure. In the South, similar groups formed, again to protect property. In this case, the property was people, enslaved people. Slave patrols smothered revolts and chased down those who, to paraphrase Frederick Douglass, tried to steal their own body. The 13th Amendment was passed in 1865, which made slavery only legal as a punishment for a crime. Former slave patrols now had an incentive to arrest and convict Black Americans for the tiniest things, to re-enslave them. Up north, police were also used to secure labor. They broke strikes by factory workers protesting for changes to their unsafe working conditions. At this time, police were appointed by elected officials and had an interest in controlling the vote of those they policed so that they could get appointed again. This political appointment system was taken out of law enforcement in the 1930s, resulting in the police careers we recognize today. Up until the 80s, police forces were funded entirely by taxes. Then came a wave of tax cuts. Suddenly, police collecting fees and fines for minor infractions became a significant way for counties to balance their budget. And it's easier to use this tactic on poor people and people of color, who are less likely to have resources and public sympathy to protect themselves. Now we're caught up with the development of American policing. These historical patterns show that the purpose of the police is not to create safety, but to secure property and labor for businesses and the state, often by harming people. This is the foundation of the argument to defund the police. Now, we'll explore police culture through the lens of psychology. Let's see what it's like to become a police officer. When new recruits are brought in, they are immediately and repeatedly shown footage of officers killed on duty. They are taught primarily by older cops, both in age and career length. Their training is nearly all about physical attacks, not law or de-escalation, and lasts a minimum of 400 to 900 hours. To compare, a North Carolina barber license requires about 1,600 hours. Once on the job, new officers learn by example to treat vulnerable people breaking a law or norm as dangerous and unworthy of respect. Those who do try to condemn this attitude are either shamed into complicity or ejected. Here are some officers we know of who called out sexual abuse, brutality, and corruption, and what happened to them afterward. Police forces adopt many aspects of the military. About 1/5 of officers are former active duty military. There's a similar hierarchy. They have military-grade gear, and they often use military vocabulary, naming the people they're called on with words for the enemy. Constantly flooding a tight-knit group of people with the same ideas about their identity over and over makes it very hard for them to accept other ideas, especially coming from perceived outsiders. Here are some reform ideas that fail due to this principle. Bias training is openly mocked within police forces, and bias test proctors let the test takers cheat. Laws against police misconduct don't change the fact that police nearly never get prosecuted for breaking these laws, and sometimes get fired for following them, as we saw earlier. And when police are given inherently non-violent tasks, they tend to approach these tasks with a militaristic mindset. Even when callers specifically request that police check in on someone's well-being, the check-ins are often traumatizing or fatal to the subjects of the call, who are treated as criminals. Police presence in schools, branded as a police community bonding experience, really just drags kids into the court system for regular misbehavior, especially for kids of color. Basically, trying to introduce a completely different worldview or responsibility to a group that intentionally sets itself in its ways is really difficult and even counterproductive. This is level 2 of the argument to defund the police. Now let's look at the final part of the argument, the opportunities that are shut down by keeping police forces. Here we go into issues of finance and politics. The resources that go into reforming a powerful, rigid system like the police do not exist in a vacuum and are not infinite. It takes a lot of money to run police forces, about 5 to 40% of the budget in major cities. Let's take a look. That range is even higher for smaller towns. Here we see that some budgets are nearly half spent on police. These police budgets are increasing, pushing out programs like education, healthcare, and housing. When people already struggling to make ends meet are stripped of access to these necessities, they will do things they don't want to do, like not fixing a broken taillight, living on the street, or shoplifting to survive, which makes more people a target for police to collect those fees and fines, which expands the police even more, creating a vicious cycle. Police reform is essentially making police fill in for the wide array of specialized tasks that they financially overtook, and spending large amounts of money and time to awkwardly repurpose them, which is a bit like a doctor performing only amputations, no matter the needs of the patients. Voters want to think their politicians can solve problems quickly and simply. More police to make the criminals go away? It's an effective campaign. But it keeps us from guarding the instinct in people to be good to one another, by making sure that nothing bad enough to override that instinct befalls us. If that's the motivation, it makes more sense to fund things that meet people's physical and mental needs. There would of course be debate on how to do that, but the conversation would be new, more constructive. So, to sum up, the police started as a tool for businesses and states to keep their labor and capital to the danger of individuals. That motivation is still deeply rooted in the police such that it's resistant to reform, and the inefficiency of that reform comes at the expense of more direct, non-violent, effective ways to keep people safe. If this video has given you something to think about, share it online and with those around you. For related information, check out these 2 resources, or find some more on your own. And if you'd like to get involved with the Defund the Police movement, but don't know where to start, look up ways you can share your views with your local government. You could also defend tax-funded community investments, or endorse a candidate who is committed to defunding. Most importantly, though, listen to the activists who are directly affected by the existence of the police. They know best what's helpful and what's not, and you can follow their cues and advice. Speaking of which, a thank you to all the individuals who have personally advocated for police abolition. While this video cites articles and studies for specific facts, much of that research would not have been done if you hadn't led the discussion and brought it to national attention.